You are about to discover one of the most incredible stories in the Bible. Imagine living a life of uncertainty, facing daily challenges that seem insurmountable, yet maintaining an unwavering faith in a promised future. This was the life of Joshua, the man who led the Israelites to the Promised Land. His story is not just an ancient tale but an eternal source of inspiration and learning. In an era where doubts and fears often outweigh courage, Joshua's journey teaches us to keep faith, trust in the divine process, and lead with integrity. From his youth as a simple servant to becoming an extraordinary leader, Joshua demonstrated that true strength comes from firm faith and tireless obedience to God. Let's embark on this journey and discover how Joshua's lessons can transform our lives today. And before we begin, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any of these incredible stories we will explore. Joshua, whose name means "the Lord is salvation," was born into the tribe of Ephraim, one of the 12 tribes of Israel. From a young age, he stood out among his peers for his courage and devotion. The son of Nun, he was not just a common face among the multitude of Israelites wandering in the desert. He was a young man with a unique destiny. His early training involved serving as Moses' assistant, where he learned leadership and faith lessons directly from the great lawgiver. It was in this role as a faithful servant that Joshua began to demonstrate his potential to lead the people of Israel. During the 40 years of wandering in the desert, Joshua distinguished himself not only for his military skills, but also for his ability to maintain calm and faith amidst adversities. He faced resource shortages, imminent dangers, and the demoralization of the people with impressive resilience. Joshua knew that his strength came from something greater than himself, his unwavering faith in God. This faith was evident to all around him, making him a figure of admiration and respect among the Israelites. Besides his courage and strategic skills, Joshua's true strength lay in his profound spirituality. He was a man of prayer, constantly seeking divine guidance for his actions. This spiritual connection was fundamental to his future conquests and the way he led the people of Israel. Joshua teaches us that true leadership goes beyond physical strength and strategic abilities. It is based on absolute trust in God and a life of prayer and obedience. Joshua not only survived the hardships of the desert, he thrived. Each challenge overcome, each battle won, reinforced his faith and prepared him for the great responsibilities that would come. His journey in the desert was a phase of refinement and preparation, where he developed the qualities that would make him an extraordinary leader. Joshua shows us that even in the most difficult times, it is possible to find strength and purpose when we trust in God's plan for our lives. Joshua's early years in the desert were marked by a series of challenges that tested his faith and resilience. As Moses' assistant, he was on the front lines, closely observing the trials and tribulations of the people of Israel. These years were a training ground for Joshua, where he learned the importance of unwavering faith, obedience, and leadership under God's guidance. It was an intense period of preparation, where each obstacle overcome strengthened his determination and confidence in the Lord. Joshua's skill as a warrior began to stand out during this period. He led the Israelites in several battles, demonstrating impressive military skills and courage that inspired others. His first major victory was against the Amalekites, where, under Moses' guidance and with God's help, he led Israel to victory. This battle was a milestone, not just for the victory itself, but for strengthening Joshua's and the people's faith in divine leadership. More than a warrior, Joshua was a strategist. He knew that victory did not come just from brute strength, but from wisdom and the ability to anticipate the enemy's moves. During the years in the desert, he developed a unique ability to think strategically, which would prove crucial in the future conquests of Canaan. His ability to remain calm under pressure and to make quick and effective decisions became a defining characteristic of his leadership. Life in the desert was also a continuous test of faith for Joshua. While many around him faltered and doubted God's promises, he remained steadfast. His unwavering faith was a source of strength not only for himself but for all the people of Israel. Joshua teaches us that even in the most adverse circumstances, faith in God can sustain us and enable us to overcome any challenge. He shows us that a leader's true strength comes from their ability to trust completely in God, regardless of the circumstances. Amid the adversities of the desert, Joshua's unwavering faith was a guiding light for the people of Israel. While many around him questioned and doubted God's promises, Joshua remained firm in his trust in the Lord. He deeply believed that God would fulfill his promises, even when circumstances seemed desperate. This unwavering faith was not just a passive belief but an active force that drove him to lead with courage and determination. Joshua witnessed many miracles during the wilderness journey, which only served to strengthen his faith further. From the crossing of the Red Sea to the daily provision of manna, he saw firsthand God's power and faithfulness. These miraculous events were not just demonstrations of divine power but constant reminders that God was with them every step of the way. For Joshua, these miracles were tangible evidence of God's commitment to his people and the certainty that the promised land would be theirs. Joshua's faith also manifested in his ability to see beyond immediate challenges and to keep focused on God's promises. He did not let difficulties or the discouragement of others deter him. Instead, he saw each obstacle as an opportunity for God to demonstrate his power and faithfulness. This positive and faith-filled perspective was crucial in keeping the people's morale high and preparing them for the battles to come. Joshua teaches us that true faith enables us to see possibilities where others see only problems. In addition to his personal faith, Joshua was dedicated to strengthening the faith of others. He was a leader who inspired confidence and hope in his people. His example of unwavering faith encouraged the Israelites to trust in God, even when circumstances were difficult. He shows us that faith is not just a matter of personal belief, but something that can be cultivated and passed on to others through example and leadership. Joshua challenges us to live a life of active and courageous faith, trusting in God in all situations. One of the most critical moments of Joshua's leadership was the sending of the 12 spies to explore the land of Canaan. This mission was not just a simple reconnaissance expedition. It was a crucial step in the Israelites' journey toward the Promised Land. Joshua, along with Caleb, was chosen among the spies to observe the land and bring back a detailed report of its conditions. The responsibility that weighed on them was immense, as their observations would shape the future actions of the entire nation. For 40 days, the spies traveled through the land of Canaan, observing its cities, fortifications, and the fertility of the soil. They saw both the positive aspects and the challenges they would face. Joshua and Caleb, in particular, were impressed by the abundance of the land, seeing it as the fulfillment of God's promises. However, the mission also revealed the presence of powerful peoples and fortified cities, which could intimidate anyone who did not have a firm faith in the Lord. Upon their return, the spies presented their reports to the Israelite community. 10 of them reported with fear and pessimism, highlighting the obstacles and the strength of the local inhabitants. In contrast, Joshua and Caleb brought a report full of faith and hope. They acknowledged the challenges but emphasized that, with God's help, the conquest of the land was possible. Their message was clear. If the Lord was pleased with them, he would lead them to victory. This contrast in perceptions shows the difference between a faith grounded in God and a perspective based solely on human circumstances. The people's reaction to the spies' report was divided. While many were swayed by fear and doubt, Joshua and Caleb maintained their stance of confidence. They faced resistance with courage, trying to persuade the people to trust in God's promises. This episode highlights the importance of courageous leadership and faith in times of uncertainty. Joshua teaches us that even when we face seemingly insurmountable challenges, we must keep our trust in God and remember his promises. Exploring the land of Canaan was an extremely important and complex task. Joshua and the other spies were tasked with assessing the promised land, determining its strengths and vulnerabilities, and reporting back to the people of Israel. For 40 days, they traveled the land, observing every detail. The fertility of the soil, the abundant harvests, and the prosperity of the cities were evident, but so were the powerful peoples and fortified cities they would have to face. This journey was not just a reconnaissance mission but a test of faith and courage for Joshua and his companions. Upon their return, the spies were divided in their perceptions. 10 of them were dominated by fear and doubt, reporting that the land devoured its inhabitants, and that the Israelites would be like grasshoppers before the giants who lived there. In contrast, Joshua and Caleb brought a hopeful and faith-filled report. They did not deny the challenges but emphasized God's promise and the certainty that, with His help, they could conquer the land. This contrast between fear and faith is a powerful lesson on how perspective can influence our decisions and actions. The people's reaction to the spies' report was one of despair and rebellion. Influenced by the fear propagated by the 10 spies, they began to murmur against Moses and Aaron, wishing to return to Egypt. Joshua and Caleb tried to calm the people, reminding them of God's promise and encouraging them to trust in the Lord. "The land we traveled through is very good," they said. "If the Lord is pleased with us, He will bring us into this land." This attempt to reverse the fear and inspire faith highlights the courageous leadership and unwavering trust of Joshua in God. This episode is a powerful reminder that faith in God can transform our vision and our actions. Joshua and Caleb show us that, even in the face of gigantic challenges, it is possible to maintain confidence and hope. They teach us that when we face difficult situations, we must remember God's promises and trust in His power and faithfulness. This story challenges us to face our own giants with a perspective based on faith, knowing that with God, nothing is impossible. Despite Joshua and Caleb's attempt to inspire faith in the people, the majority chose to follow the pessimistic report of the other spies. Fear and doubt prevailed, leading the people to murmur against Moses and Aaron and desire to return to Egypt. This response highlights how a lack of faith can paralyze and divert people from God's purpose. Joshua and Caleb stood against the tide of negativity, reaffirming their trust in God and trying to persuade the people to do the same. This resistance to fear and doubt is an example of courage and faith that continues to inspire today. The division of opinions among the spies and the people's response also teaches us about the power of words and influences. The words of fear from the 10 spies had a devastating impact, while Joshua and Caleb's voice of faith struggled to be heard. This challenges us to carefully consider the voices we choose to listen to and the words we choose to speak. Joshua shows us that amid chaos and negativity, it is possible to maintain a vision of faith and hope, trusting in God's promises to overcome any challenge. The rebellion of the people of Israel after the spies' report was one of the most painful and decisive moments in Joshua's leadership. Influenced by the fear and doubt propagated by the 10 spies, the Israelites rebelled against Moses and Aaron, expressing a desire to return to Egypt. This act of rebellion was not just a rejection of human leadership but a demonstration of a lack of faith in God's promises. Joshua and Caleb desperately tried to convince the people to trust the Lord, but their words of encouragement were drowned out by the clamor of fear and despair. The immediate consequence of this lack of faith was severe. God decreed that unbelieving generation would not enter the promised land. Instead, they would wander the desert for 40 years until all the adults who had doubted His promise had perished. Only Joshua and Caleb, the only spies who maintained their faith, were promised entry into the land of Canaan. This decree was a devastating blow, a bitter reminder of the consequences of not trusting God. The people's rebellion resulted in a lost generation, unable to see the fulfillment of God's promises due to their unbelief. For Joshua, the next 40 years were a period of learning and preparation. He saw an entire generation perish, but his faith remained firm. He continued to lead and serve with integrity, knowing that God would fulfill His promise at the right time. This period in the desert was a time of refinement for Joshua, where he learned to trust God in deeper ways and to develop the skills needed to lead the people in the conquest of Canaan. Joshua teaches us that even when our dreams are delayed, we can find strength and purpose in God's faithfulness. The rebellion of the people of Israel serves as a powerful warning about the consequences of lack of faith and disobedience. Joshua and Caleb show us that true faith is persistent and resilient, even in the face of overwhelming adversity. They challenge us to trust God, even when circumstances seem desperate, and to remember that our choices have consequences that extend beyond ourselves. The story of the rebellion and its consequences invites us to reflect on our own faith and the importance of maintaining our trust in God, regardless of the challenges we face. The 40 years that the people of Israel spent wandering in the desert were a period of preparation and refinement, both for Joshua and for the entire nation. After the rebellion and lack of faith, God decreed that that generation would not enter the promised land, resulting in a prolonged time of learning and dependence on Him. For Joshua, these years were a crucial phase of personal and spiritual development. He witnessed the consequences of disobedience and lack of faith, but also saw God's constant providence amid adversity. During these 40 years, Joshua continued to serve faithfully alongside Moses, absorbing wisdom and learning the complexities of leadership. He observed how Moses dealt with the people's complaints and rebellions, how he sought God's guidance in all decisions, and how he remained faithful to the Lord despite difficulties. This period of learning was vital for Joshua as it prepared him to assume leadership when the time came. He not only gained practical experience but also developed a deep understanding of the importance of following God's will in all circumstances. For the people of Israel, these years in the desert were a continuous lesson of trust and dependence on God. They faced challenges like the lack of water and food, enemy attacks, and internal discontent. But in each situation, God proved His faithfulness by providing for their needs. Joshua, always attentive and dedicated, saw firsthand how God cared for His people, reinforcing his own faith and trust in the Lord. This time in the desert was a spiritual preparation for the nation, teaching them the importance of obedience and faith in God. The 40-year journey in the desert was also a period of generational transition. As the old generation passed away, a new generation grew up, one that had not experienced slavery in Egypt but knew life in the desert and God's constant provision. Joshua was a witness to this transition and became a bridge between these generations. He was prepared to lead the people not just as a warrior, but as a spiritual shepherd, guiding them with wisdom and faith in the conquest of the promised land. This period teaches us that God often uses times of waiting and preparation to shape us and prepare us for the plans He has for us. The transition of leadership from Moses to Joshua was a crucial moment in Israel's history. Moses, the great liberator and lawgiver, was nearing the end of his earthly journey, and the responsibility of leading the people to the promised land would pass to Joshua. This was not an abrupt process but a carefully orchestrated transition by God, where Moses prepared Joshua to take on the mantle of leadership. This preparation involved not only practical training, but also a deep spiritual and emotional reinforcement necessary for the heavy responsibility Joshua would face. Moses, recognizing the importance of this transition, began preparing Joshua long before the final moment. He included him in important decisions, allowing Joshua to observe the complexity of leadership up close. On several occasions, Moses publicly demonstrated his confidence in Joshua, establishing his authority before the people. This continuous mentoring was vital for Joshua to assume leadership with confidence and legitimacy. The relationship between Moses and Joshua is a powerful example of how mentoring can shape and prepare new leaders for the future. One of the most significant moments of this transition was when Moses, in front of all the people, anointed Joshua as his successor. He laid hands on Joshua, a symbolic act of transferring authority and responsibility. This moment was not just a public ceremony, but a divine confirmation of Joshua's choice as leader. God, on several occasions, reaffirmed His choice, telling Joshua, "As I was with Moses, so I will be with you." These words not only validated Joshua's leadership but also gave him the courage and confidence needed to lead effectively. For the people of Israel, this leadership transition was a moment of mixed emotions. There was sadness for Moses' imminent departure, but also an expectation and hope for the future under Joshua's leadership. Joshua, in turn, demonstrated remarkable humility, not seeking power for himself but accepting the call with a deep sense of responsibility and dependence on God. He knew that leadership was not about him but about fulfilling God's purposes for the people of Israel. The transition from Moses to Joshua teaches us about the importance of preparing new leaders, trusting in God's plan, and leading with humility and faith. The crossing of the Jordan River was one of the most emblematic moments in Joshua's leadership and the Israelites' journey to the Promised Land. After 40 years of wandering in the desert, the people of Israel were finally on the verge of Canaan. The Jordan River, in full flood season, represented an apparently insurmountable obstacle. However, God instructed Joshua to lead the people through the river, promising a miracle that would confirm his presence and continued support. This crossing would not only be a physical passage but a powerful act of faith and obedience. Joshua followed the divine instructions precisely. He ordered the priests, carrying the Ark of the Covenant, to lead the crossing and enter the waters of the Jordan first. The Ark, a symbol of God's presence, was a visible reminder that God was with them. As soon as the priests' feet touched the water, the river began to recede. The waters piled up upstream, leaving a dry path for the entire people of Israel to cross. This miraculous event reaffirmed Joshua's leadership and God's faithfulness in fulfilling his promises. The crossing of the Jordan was not only an impressive miracle, it had profound spiritual significance. It was a moment of transition, marking the end of the years of wandering in the desert and the beginning of the conquest of the Promised Land. Joshua ordered 12 men, one from each tribe, to take stones from the riverbed and carry them to the camp, where they would be erected as a memorial. This monument would serve as a lasting reminder of the miracle God performed and his divine faithfulness. It was a way to ensure that future generations would know and remember God's power and provision. The crossing of the Jordan also symbolized the need for faith and obedience to overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. The people of Israel, led by Joshua, demonstrated that when we follow God's instructions, He makes the impossible happen. This event challenges us to reflect on our own crossings of the Jordan, those situations in our lives that seem impossible to overcome. Joshua's and the Israelites' story encourages us to trust God, follow His guidance, and believe that He can make a way where there seems to be none. In addition to being a historical landmark, the memorial at Gilgal had profound spiritual significance. It represented the transition from dependence on manna in the desert to the abundant provision of the Promised Land. Gilgal became the Israelites' first camp in Canaan, a place where they celebrated Passover for the first time in the new land. This memorial was a physical reminder that God had fulfilled His promise to bring His people to the land He swore to their ancestors. It was a testimony that God was faithful and that He would continue to be their source of strength and sustenance. The lesson of the Gilgal Memorial is relevant even today. In our lives, we often face moments of miracles and divine provision that deserve to be remembered and celebrated. Creating our own memorials, whether through written records, physical markers, or spiritual practices, helps us remember God's interventions and strengthen our faith. Joshua teaches us that by keeping the memory of God's deeds alive, we not only honor the past but also strengthen our confidence in the future. By looking at these memorials, we are reminded that God is faithful and that He will continue to guide and sustain us. The Siege of Jericho is one of the most memorable and strategic episodes of Joshua's campaign to conquer Canaan. Jericho, a heavily fortified city, posed a massive challenge to the Israelites. However, instead of relying on conventional military techniques, Joshua followed God's detailed instructions, which involved an unusual and seemingly irrational strategy. God ordered the Israelites to march around the city once a day for 6 days, with the priests blowing trumpets. On the 7th day, they were to march around the city 7 times, and at the end, the priests would blow the trumpets, and the people were to shout loudly. This strategy, although unusual, was a test of obedience and faith. Joshua led the people with determination and confidence in God's instructions, even when the military logic did not make sense. During the first 6 days, the Israelites marched in silence around the city while the priests blew the trumpets. This silent march was an act of discipline and patience, demonstrating their total dependence on God for victory. The inhabitants of Jericho, observing this strange procession, probably felt a mixture of fear and confusion, not understanding the true power behind the Israelites' actions. On the 7th day, according to the instructions, the Israelites marched 7 times around Jericho. At the end of the 7th round, at the sound of the trumpets and the people's shout, the city walls miraculously collapsed. The Israelites stormed Jericho and completely conquered it. This event was a clear demonstration of God's power and the effectiveness of unwavering obedience to his instructions. The fall of Jericho was more than a military victory. It was a testimony that the battle belonged to the Lord and that with him, even the most impregnable fortifications could be demolished. The conquest of Jericho teaches us several important lessons. Firstly, it highlights the importance of obedience to God, even when his instructions seem illogical. Joshua and the Israelites followed the divine strategy without questioning, fully trusting in God's plan. Secondly, the story emphasizes that true victory comes from God and not from our own strength or wisdom. Finally, the siege of Jericho reminds us that God can use unexpected methods to accomplish his purposes, and that we must be willing to follow him with faith and courage, regardless of the circumstances. The fall of Jericho served as a warning and demonstration to the other nations of Canaan. The news of this miraculous victory certainly spread quickly, instilling fear in the hearts of Israel's enemies. The neighboring nations realized that the Israelites were not merely a strong people, but a people whose God was capable of performing the impossible. The victory at Jericho was a turning point in Joshua's campaign, demonstrating that God was with Israel and that his promises were being fulfilled in a powerful and tangible way. The conquest of Canaan was a period of intense battles and carefully orchestrated strategies under Joshua's leadership. After the fall of Jericho, the Israelites faced a series of challenges as they advanced to take possession of the Promised Land. Each battle required not only military strength but also constant dependence on divine guidance. Joshua, always faithful to God's instructions, led the people with courage and wisdom, demonstrating an impressive combination of strategic skill and unwavering faith. The episode of Achan's sin is one of the most striking stories about the importance of obedience and the severe consequences of disobedience. After the impressive victory at Jericho, God ordered that all the spoils of the city be dedicated to him, an act of consecration and obedience. However, Achan, disobeying this order, took some of the dedicated items for himself. This act of disobedience had grave repercussions not only for Achan but for the entire Israelite community. The immediate consequence of Achan's sin was the Israelites' defeat in the battle against the city of Ai. Confident after the victory at Jericho, the Israelites underestimated Ai's strength and were surprised by a humiliating defeat. Joshua, perplexed and distressed, sought God's guidance to understand the reason for the defeat. God revealed that Achan's sin was the cause and that disobedience had brought divine wrath upon the people. This episode illustrates the importance of collective obedience and how individual sin can have corporate consequences. The discovery of Achan's sin was a painful but necessary process for the purification of the people. Joshua followed God's instructions to identify the culprit, going through a meticulous process of elimination until Achan was exposed. Achan confessed his sin, and as a result, he and his family were severely punished. This punishment may seem extreme by modern standards, but it served to emphasize God's holiness and the seriousness of obedience to his commands. Eliminating the sin from among the people was crucial to restoring their relationship with God and ensuring success in future battles. The episode of Achan teaches us several important lessons. Firstly, it highlights the gravity of disobedience and the importance of following divine instructions to the letter. Secondly, it shows that sin, even when committed in secret, has visible and tangible consequences that affect not only the individual but the entire community. Finally, Achan's story challenges us to examine our own lives and remove anything that might be separating us from God. Joshua shows us that obedience and holiness are essential to experiencing the fullness of God's blessings. As they advanced, Joshua and the Israelites faced a coalition of Canaanite kingdoms that united to resist the invasion. One of these battles took place in Gibeon, where God intervened spectacularly, making the sun stand still in the sky to give the Israelites more time to defeat their enemies. This battle not only highlighted Joshua's strategic superiority but also demonstrated God's supernatural power in action. The divine intervention during this battle reinforced the conviction that Israel's victory did not depend solely on their military strength, but on God's favor and direct intervention. The conquest of Canaan was a gradual and continuous process that required patience, perseverance, and constant faith. Joshua divided his forces to attack different regions simultaneously, preventing the enemies from regrouping and counterattacking effectively. Each victory further consolidated Israel's position in the Promised Land. Joshua's campaign is a powerful example of how faith in God, combined with strategic planning and obedience, can lead to the achievement of seemingly unattainable goals. For us, the story of the conquest of Canaan reminds us that with God by our side, we can face and overcome any challenge, no matter how difficult it may seem. After the conquest of Canaan, the task of distributing the land among the tribes of Israel was a significant challenge that required wisdom, justice, and sensitivity. Joshua, under divine guidance, led this process with integrity and transparency, ensuring that each tribe received the portion of land promised to their ancestors. The distribution of the land was not just an administrative matter but a fulfillment of God's promises made centuries earlier to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The distribution process began with the tribes of Judah, Ephraim, and Manasseh, which received their portions first due to their prominence and size. Assigning these portions involved not only considering the geography and available resources but also respecting each tribe's traditions and specific needs. Joshua worked closely with the priest Eleazar and tribal leaders to ensure the division was fair and equitable. This collaborative approach helped maintain peace and unity among the tribes during this critical settlement period. One of the most complex issues during the distribution was the treatment of the tribe of Levi. Unlike the other tribes, the Levites did not receive a continuous portion of land. Instead, they were assigned cities scattered throughout Israel's territory. This dispersion had a spiritual purpose, ensuring that the Levites, responsible for religious services and the people's spiritual education, were present in all regions. This decision underscores the importance of integrating spiritual life into the nation's everyday structure. Another significant aspect was how Joshua handled special situations, such as the request of Zelophehad's daughters, who had no brothers to inherit their father's land. Joshua, faithful to Moses' instructions, ensured that these women received their inheritance, setting an important precedent for justice and gender equality in Israelite society. This act not only reaffirmed Joshua's commitment to justice but also demonstrated his sensitivity to individual and family needs within the larger community context. The distribution of land under Joshua's leadership teaches us about the importance of just, inclusive leadership sensitive to everyone's needs. The story of Zelophehad's daughters is a remarkable example of justice and equality in ancient Israel. Zelophehad, from the tribe of Manasseh, died without leaving male heirs, which, according to traditional inheritance laws, meant that his lands would pass to other male relatives. However, his 5 daughters Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah did not accept losing their father's inheritance without a fight. They approached Moses and the community leaders to claim their right to the inheritance, arguing that their father's name should not be erased just because he had no sons. Moses brought the case of Zelophehad's daughters before God, who responded favorably to their request. God instructed Moses to grant them their father's inheritance, thereby establishing an important precedent for gender equality in inheritance law. This event was significant not only because it ensured justice for Zelophehad's daughters, but because it introduced a new law that allowed women to inherit property in the absence of male heirs. Joshua, as Moses' successor, faithfully followed this instruction during the land distribution in Canaan. The decision to grant inheritance to Zelophehad's daughters was a crucial step in promoting justice and equality within Israelite society. It demonstrated that divine law could be adapted to ensure justice and that individual needs and rights were important. This specific case also highlighted the importance of women's voices in society and showed that they could assert their rights legitimately and respectfully. Joshua, in implementing this law, demonstrated his commitment to justice and to the faithful application of God's instructions. For us, the story of Zelophehad's daughters is a powerful reminder that divine justice transcends cultural and social norms. It challenges us to strive for justice and equality in our own lives and societies, to recognize and correct injustices, and to value the voices and rights of all individuals, regardless of gender. Joshua's leadership, in honoring and implementing this decision, teaches us that true leadership involves listening, understanding, and acting according to the principles of justice and equality established by God. Caleb, Joshua's companion on the spies expedition, is a remarkable example of faith and perseverance. At 85 years old, he still exhibited the same energy and determination he had 45 years earlier when he first explored Canaan. Caleb approached Joshua with a specific request: the city of Hebron, a mountainous and heavily defended region, which he had been promised by God due to his faithfulness. Caleb's story is a powerful demonstration of how faith and perseverance are rewarded by God. Caleb reminded Joshua of the promise God had made to him through Moses. He affirmed that despite the challenges and his advanced age, he still felt as strong as the day he was sent as a spy. This extraordinary confidence and vigor were the result of his unwavering faith in God. He did not ask for an easy task. He chose a challenge that required courage and determination, trusting that God would be with him to defeat the giants and conquer the land. Joshua, recognizing Caleb's faith and dedication, granted him Hebron, as promised. Caleb's conquest of Hebron was a testament to his practical and persevering faith. He led his family and followers to drive out the local inhabitants, demonstrating that age was no barrier to fulfilling God's purposes. Caleb's victory was a confirmation that God fulfills his promises to those who remain faithful and persevering. Hebron, one of Canaan's oldest and most significant cities, became a symbol of divine reward for those who trust God unwaveringly. Caleb's story is a powerful inspiration for all of us. It challenges us to maintain our faith and perseverance, regardless of circumstances or age. Caleb shows us that it is never too late to claim God's promises and that true strength comes from faith. He reminds us that with God, we can face and overcome any challenge, no matter how great. Caleb's life is a testimony that faithfulness to God is always rewarded, and that when we follow his will with courage and determination, we can achieve great things, regardless of our age or situation. Joshua was not only a military leader, but also a spiritual leader who understood the importance of maintaining the traditions and faith of the people of Israel. After the initial conquest of Canaan, he dedicated himself to restoring and strengthening the people's spiritual practices and their bond with God. One of his first actions was to circumcise all the men born during the years of wandering in the desert, a practice that had been neglected during that time. This act of obedience was crucial in reaffirming Israel's covenant with God. Besides circumcision, Joshua led the celebration of Passover in Gilgal, marking the first time this important festival was observed in the Promised Land. Passover, which commemorated Israel's liberation from slavery in Egypt, was a powerful reminder of God's power and faithfulness. Celebrating it in Canaan, the Promised Land, had special significance, symbolizing the fulfillment of God's promises. By ensuring the observance of this tradition, Joshua reinforced the people's spiritual identity and the continuity of their religious practices. Joshua also followed Moses' instructions to establish cities of refuge, where those who committed accidental manslaughter could seek protection and justice. This system of cities of refuge was a practical demonstration of God's mercy and justice, ensuring that even in cases of tragedy, justice was administered fairly and compassionately. By implementing these cities, Joshua showed his commitment to applying divine laws and maintaining a just and orderly society. Joshua's spiritual leadership was marked by a balance of firmness and compassion. He not only led the people in war, but also guided them in worship and obedience to God. His life and leadership teach us that true leadership involves caring for both the people's spiritual and physical needs. Joshua challenges us to consider how we can maintain and strengthen our own spiritual practices and traditions, always remembering that faithfulness to God is the foundation of a successful and blessed life. At the end of his life, Joshua gathered all the tribes of Israel at Shechem for a final address, a solemn moment of renewing their commitment to God. This address was not just a farewell, but an urgent call to continued faithfulness. Joshua began by recounting Israel's history, from Abraham's call to the conquest of Canaan, highlighting God's faithfulness and interventions at every stage. He wanted the people to remember God's mighty works and recognize that all they had achieved was a direct result of divine intervention. After this historical recap, Joshua issued a clear and direct challenge to the people. Choose this day whom you will serve. He was aware of the temptations and influences of the pagan peoples around and wanted to ensure that Israel remained faithful to the one true God. With unwavering conviction, Joshua declared, "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." This moment was a call to personal and collective decision, an invitation for each family and individual to reaffirm their commitment to God. The people's response was unanimous, promising to serve the Lord and renounce foreign gods. Joshua was not content with a superficial response. He warned the people about the seriousness of their commitment and the consequences of straying from God. He wanted to ensure they fully understood the magnitude of their decision. To seal this renewed commitment, Joshua wrote the words in the book of the law of God and erected a large stone as a witness. This stone would be a constant reminder of the covenant the people made with God that day. Joshua was determined to leave a legacy of faithfulness and obedience that would transcend his own life. Joshua's final address challenges us to reflect on our own spiritual commitments. It reminds us of the importance of remembering God's works in our lives and regularly reaffirming our devotion to Him. Joshua's story encourages us to make conscious and deliberate choices to serve God, regardless of the influences around us. His example of leadership and faithfulness inspires us to live lives that honor God and to leave a lasting spiritual legacy for future generations. Joshua, the courageous leader who led Israel to the Promised Land, left a legacy of faith and obedience that continues to inspire generations. His life is a powerful testimony of how trust in God and a willingness to follow His instructions can lead to extraordinary accomplishments. From his early days as Moses' servant to his final years as Israel's leader, Joshua demonstrated unwavering faith and constant obedience to divine commands. He shows us that, with God, even the most imposing obstacles can be overcome. Joshua's legacy is not just a series of military victories, but an example of spiritual leadership and integrity. He not only conquered lands, but also guided the people in their spiritual journey, strengthening their faith and commitment to God. Through acts like the celebration of Passover, the implementation of cities of refuge, and the renewal of the covenant at Shechem, Joshua ensured that worship and obedience to God remained central in Israel's life. His leadership teaches us that true and lasting success comes from following God's will faithfully. For us today, Joshua's story is an invitation to reflect on our own faith journey. It challenges us to trust in God, even when we face seemingly insurmountable challenges, and to follow His instructions with obedience and courage. Joshua shows us that true leadership comes from serving God and His people with integrity and dedication. He inspires us to live lives that not only seek material achievements but also leave a lasting spiritual legacy. In conclusion, Joshua's journey is a rich narrative of faith, obedience, and leadership. His life is a shining example of how God can use those who are willing to trust Him and follow His way. May we, like Joshua, choose to serve the Lord with all our hearts and leave a legacy of faith and obedience that inspires and guides future generations. If you felt inspired by this story, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more content that strengthens faith and spiritual life.